Today, we're going to be talking about economic and environmental policy in the United States. Um, I guess internationally, it doesn't really matter. But let's talk about a couple of the terms that are important for us to actually know, such as what is an economy? An economy is a system of production and consumption of goods and services that are allowed through exchange. So, like you can pay money to get something, or you get um, something in return for something that you actually give something else to, or you could give services for services, or you could give um, items for items. Whatever exchange happens, that's basically what drives your economy. And there's all sorts. We're not going to get into um, the implement the implications of, like, the different types of economies, like, socialism and communism and capitalism and all that. For the most part, we're focusing on capitalism because that's the system that we actually live in. So one of the other terms that are important to know is called laissez-faire economics, not to be confused with laissez-faire government, which quite often, and a lot of people kind of mistakenly think of it as, do nothing kind of government, which is yes and no, not really exactly what it is. But for economics, basically, it just means private firms should be left alone. Should be free to make whatever production decisions they decide to actually make, to better build them going forward. And the reason laissez-faire economics is quite often seen as really strong or desired in a capitalistic system is because it gives people the ability to be innovative and do the things that they actually want to do, and not have a government or strong regulation stopping them from actually doing anything. And so some systems have kind of fallen apart by not having the ability to do it. Good example is some of the Soviet countries during the Cold War, which is like the Soviet Union, Poland, and all sorts of other countries that had very, very steadfast rules on what they could and couldn't do for their economy. Even building luggage was like a huge thing where you had to actually get the government to, approve the ability to actually make it. And so stuff like that caused those not just the businesses, but those countries themselves to not prosper because they were making no money. And therefore, if you make no money, you have no resources to put back into your system to get better and bigger things, and more services. So one of the other terms we're going to look at is called economic efficiency, which is when the output of goods and services is the highest possible amount given the amount of input that you put into the system. It's really important to have, because if you don't have economic efficiency, you have deficits and loss. And if you have loss, things aren't good, and it can lead to destabilization, and it can sometimes cause a government to collapse. Sorry about that. One of the things that kind of came about in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan was well, he didn't create it, but he really implemented it and made it a thing of government, and it was the idea of deregulation. Conservatives, for the longest period of time, have thought that the more laissez-faire approach, the removing government and regulations from the whole issue, will actually cause businesses to do better, and then therefore everything improves. So the idea was government itself was overregulated, and it was overregulating. So the idea was to move deregulation and get rules away from the whole system, so things will get a lot easier. So basically, a lot of organizations and groups and foundations were practically gutted overnight, and whether or not the ramifications have been great is a completely different, debatable subject, but it has caused all sorts of problems because a lot of that money did not get replaced, and a lot of the regulation actually caused all sorts of other problems where you have like situations leading to overfracking and over other kinds of issues that aren't addressed because there's nobody actually helping to make things better. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's always bad. I mean, if you look at like the phone company system, where at one point the phone company was owned by one company, so it got deregulated, and basically tons and tons of different agencies kind of came up, or not agencies, but different companies came up, and those companies replaced what they had before. Well, they were quite a few of them were quite innovative, and so in the old days, if you walked into an AT&T, or back then Pacific Bell, whatever the company was, the phone company, what was it, the TPC in the movie. Anyway, so the idea was if we got away from that, um, what ended up happening was, well, like I said, if you walked into one of these companies, you would see 5 phones, and your choice and limitations were limited to almost nothing, and it was huge lack of innovation. And so after deregulation came along, basically innovation was overnight, and we have like a cell phone industry now that we never would have had before, because the phone company wasn't going to do it. At least they had no incentive to do it, because as long as when you don't have regulations, oh, I'm sorry, when you have regulations, you're going to end up with this inability to make change and kind of do the status quo and stay with it because it works, and people have an incentive to kind of keep doing the same things, and nobody learns anything new. So government has a couple of roles in our economy that are important for us to point out. It's often seen as the protector of the environment, which is a more recent kind of a thing. It's also seen as the promoter of economic interests. So it does a whole bunch of things to try to make that actually happen. So quite often we have a couple of process of doing that, which is demand side policy and supply side policy, which are much more detailed in the process, but it's kind of how we handle a lot of these situations. So, but it leads us to a problem with limitations because of how much government is actually able to do based on politics. I mean, remember, you've got 2 sides to practically every issue. So you have to do compromise, or you have to literally push things through to the point of where you can have all sorts of problems. So a couple of the problems that came about, one was budget deficits. What would happen is we would end up incurring so much money that we were borrowing and not able to actually put into the budget itself. So every time it came to deciding on a budget, you'd have Congress constantly fighting back and forth because what should get more money, what should get money taken out of it. Those issues become very political rather than practical. One of the other problems we ran into is we started kicking the can down the road. If you understand the phrase, it means there was a problem we needed to deal with right then and there, but we didn't. And we didn't do it because it was easier not to do it. So if I was in office and I didn't want to have my constituents not vote for me the next time around, it was really beneficial to me to not bring up new taxes or not add new things we had to pay for. Instead, it benefited me to actually bring more programs, but not have a way to actually pay for it. And so that created a national debt. And that national debt just kept getting worse and worse. And again, we would kick the can down the road. So the next fiscal year, we would add to the national debt. So whereas before there was back during the Bill Clinton era, there was almost an approach to pay off the national debt. They weren't going to actually do it, but they were getting closer to starting to pay more into it than they were actually, putting in, or than they were incurring as debt. And then overnight, they basically went, not doing that, and started borrowing all sorts of money. Then we had the Gulf War, and then with the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, um, we ended up in a situation where rather than being able to pay for the things we did, we just kicked the can down the road, and we got to the point where we literally can't afford what we have today. And so we're borrowing a lot of money from other countries like China, and then just trying to not pay attention to the fact that our debt is growing into interest, and that interest is getting worse. And there's literally no attempt to pay it back now. It's just let's continue kicking the can down the road and kind of hope that the next people, take over and fix it, and hopefully I'll retire by then, is kind of like the attitude. Not a good attitude to have, but it's kind of where we are. So there's been a desire to push balanced budgets, to stop this continuous, incurring of more money being spent, and or more money being racked up as debt. But part of the problem with that is we have this interest on the debt that is literally overwhelming the actual debt itself. So it's kind of like that student loan that you have that started off with $20,000. You didn't pay it off and just kept pushing it down the road. Now it's $60,000, which is all from the interest. It's not anything new you got, no better advantages that you had when you started, but now you end up paying a lot more money because kicking it down the road kind of gets us to that sort of place. So at least one thing that's really important to bring up, because it's kind of been a part of our system for quite a while. It's supposed to deal with a lot of these issues, and it's called the Fed. And it was created by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And so what their job is they're supposed to be non-political, and they're supposed to control the interest rates, such as raising it or lowering it, and basically that affects how much money gets thrown into the system or pushed into the system. And it generally works pretty well if it's very, very well maintained, but sometimes we run into that same situation we have with just our regular government and budgets, where people see it as free money, and let it pay for things later. Well, we'll end up in a situation where there's a pandemic or a war or something to that effect, and the idea is let's pay for it now, or let's have the money for it now and then pay for it later. But again, we kind of not get to later, which is a huge problem, because eventually the money comes due, and I don't actually have a response to you on how or when you would pay that off when you don't have it. And it's like going to that one person that owes you money and they don't have money. What do? Borrow it from friends? That's kind of what we're doing now. And so now we need money to pay off the money we borrowed from friends. So keep that in mind. One of the other problems we come up with budgetary problems or fiscal problems is inflation. And so this just means that the cost for goods and services continues to increase. And as it increases, it makes the money worth less. And so we've run into quite a bit of that lately, and it can get out of control. In Germany, right before the World War II, inflation got so bad that basically they couldn't print money as fast as they literally needed it. So or they were printing too much money, so basically it was worthless. And so that's kind of what inflation is. So the money was worth far less. If you get the idea, that's kind of how it works. And so it wasn't really a huge thing in this country, because like I said, it did happen in Germany in the 1930s, but again, it hasn't really been a national problem here until about the 1960s. Because in the 1960s, or at least the very end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s, we had the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War incurred massive amounts of money. And so it was one of those things that we had to keep pushing down the line, and it got to the point where you couldn't afford it. And we couldn't afford it then, and so it drove inflation, and inflation has never gone down since then. And it continues to increase quite a bit. So that's just a basic idea of monetary systems and monetary policy in the United States. Not a whole lot of information to deal with, but it's enough that it's probably something you might want to read up on the chapters to make sure that you're keeping up on exactly what you need to read.